The year was 1963. New York City was a metropolis of invisible borders. Harlem belonged to the blacks. Little Italy belonged to the Italians. Chinatown belonged to the Chinese. Washington Heights belonged to the Puerto Ricans. And everyone belonged to the mob, but not really, not if you understood the hierarchy. The mob, the real mob, the made men, the families with names like Genovese and Gambino and Colombo, they owned everything. They owned the streets and the buildings and the businesses and the dreams of people trying to survive in a city that had never shown mercy to anyone. They owned the politicians and the police and the judges. They owned the very concept of law and order. But there were limits to what you could own. There were men who couldn't be controlled. There were territories that resisted conquest. Harlem was one of those territories, and Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson was one of those men. For the past 5 years, since his release from Alcatraz, Bumpy had been building something. An organization that kept the Italian mob out of Harlem. Not by being more powerful. Bumpy had no delusions about that. The Italian families had more money, more soldiers, more institutional support. Bumpy kept them out through a combination of intelligence, ruthlessness, political connections, and an absolute refusal to surrender. It was working, mostly. The mob still operated in other boroughs. They still had their hands in narcotics, numbers, gambling, prostitution. But Harlem was becoming a sanctuary, a place where a black man could build an empire without bowing to some Italian don in Manhattan. The mob didn't like that. They'd tried to move in several times. They'd tried to negotiate. They'd tried to intimidate. Nothing had worked. Bumpy simply wouldn't bend. So they decided to send someone else. Someone who didn't work through negotiation or intimidation. Someone who worked through terror. His name was Vincent Carmine Rizzuto, but everyone called him the Butcher. And for good reason. The Butcher was a legend in the criminal underworld, the kind of legend that made even other killers uncomfortable. There were 17 documented murders attributed to him, though the actual number was probably much higher. Some people whispered it was closer to 40. Others claimed even higher. The truth was that nobody knew exactly how many men Vincent Rizzuto had killed. Bodies didn't always surface. Men didn't always have families looking for them. Disappearances happened in New York every day, and most of them were never explained. What people did know about the Butcher was this: he was efficient. He didn't take pleasure in killing. He didn't make a mess. He did the job and disappeared. He was a professional in a field where professionalism was rare. He was also completely psychologically unavailable. Soldiers who'd worked with him said that his eyes were dead, that looking at Vincent Rizzuto was like looking into the face of a man who'd already died and hadn't quite realized it yet. He didn't seem to experience fear or joy or anger. He experienced only work, only purpose, only the next contract. The mob had employed him for over a decade, and in that time, he'd become the family's most prized asset. The one you sent when you needed something done without complications. The one who would walk into hell itself and walk back out again, having completed his assignment. And now, in the summer of 1963, the mob had sent him to Harlem. His contract was simple: eliminate Ellsworth Johnson, make him disappear, remove him from the board so that the mob could move in and consolidate territory. The payment was substantial $50,000, which was a fortune in 1963. The timeline was open-ended. Take as long as you need, but get it done. The Butcher accepted the contract without hesitation. He always did. Bumpy Johnson didn't know he was being hunted. Or rather, he suspected it. He always suspected it, but he didn't know for certain. He didn't know that a professional killer had been hired. He didn't know that the mob had given up on negotiation and had decided that he needed to die. What Bumpy did know was that his position in Harlem was becoming more precarious. The mob was getting more aggressive. There had been attempts at intimidation. There had been threats. There had been violence directed at some of his lower-level associates. The pressure was building, but Bumpy had survived Alcatraz. He'd survived the streets of Harlem when it was even worse than it was now. He'd survived prison violence and institutional cruelty and everything the world had thrown at him. He wasn't about to start running now. On a Tuesday in late July, Bumpy was walking through Harlem, just walking. He did this, sometimes moved through the neighborhood without security, without entourage, just a man in a suit moving through his own territory. It was partly confidence, partly recklessness, partly a statement that he would not be confined or controlled or made to hide. He was walking down 128th Street near Lenox Avenue when he became aware that he was being followed. It was the kind of awareness that came from experience, from years of being watched, from surviving in spaces where violence was always possible. Bumpy didn't turn around. He didn't change his pace. He simply became aware someone was behind him, someone who'd been very good at being invisible, but not quite good enough to be invisible to someone like Bumpy Johnson. Bumpy kept walking. He turned onto a side street, a narrow alley that cut between two buildings. The alley was dark, the sun was already dropping toward the horizon, and the buildings were close enough that they blocked out what remained of the daylight. The alley was the kind of place where things happened, bad things, fatal things, and Bumpy walked into it deliberately. Because Bumpy Johnson understood something that most men never learned. Sometimes the only way to survive is to stop running. Sometimes the only way to take control of a situation is to step directly into the danger instead of away from it. The butcher was surprised. Vincent Rizzuto had been following Bumpy for 3 days. He'd learned his routines, his patterns, his vulnerabilities. He'd identified this alley as the perfect location for what he had in mind. Isolated, dark, no witnesses, no cameras, just the walls of two buildings and the street beyond. He'd planned to approach from behind, quick and efficient. Garrote around the neck, pressure. It would take less than 30 seconds. Bumpy would lose consciousness almost immediately. The butcher would drag the body deeper into the alley, leave it there for someone else to find, disappear into the city, and be back in his hotel by evening. Simple, professional, clean, but Bumpy had turned into the alley deliberately, and he'd turned around to face the butcher directly. "Vincent Rizzuto," Bumpy said, his voice calm in the darkness. "The butcher. The mob's favorite killer. I've been expecting you." The butcher stopped. For the first time in years, maybe in his entire adult life, the butcher was surprised. It was a minor reaction, barely visible, but Bumpy saw it. "How did you know my name?" the butcher asked. His voice was soft and neutral, the voice of a man making conversation about the weather. "I know everything that happens in my city," Bumpy said. "I know that the mob has been getting more aggressive. I know that they've decided negotiation isn't working. I know they sent someone, and I know who they sent, because I make it my business to know." The butcher tilted his head slightly, the way a man might tilt his head while trying to understand a math problem, but there was no confusion in his eyes. There was no emotion of any kind. "Your business," the butcher said, "is about to end." He reached into his jacket. Bumpy could see the garrote in his hand, a simple device, 2 wooden handles connected by wire, tested and effective. The weapon of someone who understood that sometimes simple was better than complicated. But Bumpy didn't move. He stood there in the darkness of that alley, facing the most feared killer in New York, and he didn't move. "You know what your problem is, Vincent?" Bumpy said. "You're fast, you're professional, you know how to kill people, but you don't understand people. You don't understand why I'm standing here. You don't understand what I want." The butcher paused. It was a small pause, maybe 2 seconds, but in that alley, in that darkness, it was an eternity. "I don't care what you want," the butcher said. "I only care about what I'm paid to do." "I know," Bumpy said. "That's why you'll fail." What happened next happened very quickly. The butcher moved with the efficiency of someone who'd practiced violence so much that it had become unconscious. He moved forward, garrote ready, expecting Bumpy to try to run or dodge or defend himself, but Bumpy did something unexpected. He stepped toward the butcher instead of away. It was a small movement, just 1 step, but it changed everything. It destroyed the distance that the butcher needed. It put Bumpy inside the butcher's reach, which was the worst place for the killer because his garrote worked at a distance. At the same time, Bumpy reached out and grabbed the butcher's wrist. Bumpy wasn't a large man. He was shorter and lighter than the butcher, but he had the strength that came from years of physical labor and prison training and absolute commitment to not dying. The butcher tried to pull his wrist free, but Bumpy held firm. Then Bumpy did something that the butcher didn't expect. He didn't try to punch or fight or engage in physical combat. Instead, he did something psychological. He looked directly into the butcher's eyes. "Look at me," Bumpy said. "Really, look at me. I'm not afraid of you. I'm not running from you. I'm not begging for my life. I'm not doing any of the things that the men you've killed have probably done. Because I understand something that you don't understand. The butcher was struggling now, trying to free his wrist, trying to maneuver his garrote into position. But there was something in Bumpy's voice that made him pause. Something in the tone that suggested knowledge. "What do you understand?" the butcher asked, and there was something different in his voice now, a question, an actual curiosity. "I understand that you've been dead your whole life," Bumpy said. "I understand that somewhere along the way, you chose to become a tool instead of a man. You chose to have no purpose except what other people tell you to have. You chose to have no identity except what you do for the families." The butcher wrenched his wrist free and stepped back. He was breathing harder now. Not from exertion, the movement had been easy for him, but from something else. From the words he'd heard. "That's psychology," the butcher said dismissively. "That's not going to stop me." "I know," Bumpy said. "But here's what will. Here's what you don't understand about Harlem. Here's what you don't understand about this situation." Bumpy gestured around the alley, at the shadows, at the darkness. "You came here thinking you were the predator, and I was the prey. You came here thinking that your training and your reputation and your efficiency would be enough. But you made a fundamental mistake." "What mistake?" the butcher asked. "You came into my territory," Bumpy said. "You came into a place where I have allies, where I have people who would die for me, where every corner you turn, every shadow you enter, there's someone watching. You're the best killer in New York City, Vincent, but you're not better than a community. You're not better than 100 men willing to die to protect their leader." The butcher was quiet for a moment. Then he looked around the alley, really looked at it, understanding something that he'd missed before. The alley wasn't empty. There were men in the shadows. Not many, maybe 4 or 5. But they were there, emerging from the darkness like ghosts, like the urban warriors they were. Men from Bumpy's organization. Men who'd followed Bumpy into the alley because they understood what he was doing. The butcher looked at the men, then back at Bumpy. "This changes nothing," he said. "I'll still complete my contract, I'll just take more time." "You'll try," Bumpy said. "But here's what happens if you do. You kill me and you live maybe another week before every asset the mob has in Harlem is systematically eliminated. You kill me and you trigger a war that costs more lives and more money than your fee. You kill me and you become a liability instead of an asset. And the families don't keep liabilities around." The butcher was silent. He was processing this information. His professional mind was calculating odds, weighing options, understanding consequences. "So, what do you propose?" the butcher asked. And that question, that simple professional question, showed that something had shifted. "I propose you go back to the families," Bumpy said. "I propose you tell them that I can't be killed. Not because I'm immortal, not because I'm superhuman, but because my life is worth more to Harlem than my death. Because Harlem will fight harder than any organization the mob can muster. Because you'd be killing a symbol, and symbols can't die." The butcher looked at the men in the shadows. He looked at Bumpy. He looked at his garrote. Then he put the garrote back in his jacket. "You're right," he said quietly. "You can't be killed. Not by me. Not without a war that the families aren't prepared for." He turned to walk away, but Bumpy called after him. "Vincent, one more thing." The butcher turned back. "You said you didn't care what I want. You said you only care about what you're paid to do. I'm asking you to care about something else. I'm asking you to think about what you could become if you stopped being what other people tell you to be." The butcher looked at Bumpy for a long moment. His eyes, which had been dead throughout the encounter, seemed to show a flicker of something. A moment of weakness, a moment where the armor cracked and a man showed through. "That's not who I am," the butcher said finally. "It is," Bumpy said. "You just haven't admitted it yet." The butcher left Harlem that night. He returned to his hotel, packed his belongings, and caught a flight to Los Angeles. He didn't report back to the families. He didn't explain his failure or make excuses. He simply disappeared. It took the Genovese family 3 days to figure out what had happened. When they finally understood that their most prized killer had abandoned his contract, they were furious. They sent people looking for him. They issued orders for his execution. They tried to locate him in Los Angeles, but Vincent Rizzuto, the butcher, had vanished completely. Not dead, not captured, just gone. Disappeared into a new life, a new identity. A life away from the families and the contracts and the weight of being the thing people feared most. Some say he lived quietly in Los Angeles, working honest jobs, trying to rebuild something human in himself. Others say he moved to Mexico and spent his remaining years drinking and thinking about the man in the Harlem alley who'd made him question what he was. Nobody ever confirmed either story. Vincent Rizzuto, the butcher, simply became another legend in a city of legends. The story of that night in the alley spread through Harlem like fire. Bumpy Johnson had faced the mob's most feared killer in a dark alley, and instead of fighting him, instead of killing him, Bumpy had somehow made him question his entire existence. Bumpy had looked into the eyes of a man who'd killed dozens of people and had seen something human that the butcher hadn't known was there. The story changed everything. The mob understood something that night that they hadn't understood before. Bumpy Johnson wasn't just a criminal, he was a force. He was something that couldn't be eliminated through conventional means. The territories they'd fought so hard to claim were now clearly his, not by right of the law, but by right of will, by right of something deeper and more fundamental than money or organization or firepower. The mob pulled back. They stopped their aggressive moves into Harlem. They stopped trying to eliminate Bumpy Johnson. They understood that the cost was too high. Within months, the Italian families and Bumpy Johnson came to a formal understanding. Harlem would remain Bumpy's territory. In exchange, Bumpy's organization wouldn't expand into other boroughs. It was a negotiated peace, but it was a peace that Bumpy had earned, not through negotiation, but through an act of profound courage and psychological insight. In the years that followed, Bumpy became something more than a criminal boss. He became a symbol of resistance. A man who had faced the most powerful organizations in the city and had not bowed. A man who had encountered pure violence and had responded with philosophy. Other detainees in Harlem's prisons began to study Bumpy. Other community leaders began to seek his counsel. Other organizations began to model themselves on his approach, using intelligence and community connections instead of just firepower to maintain territory. The alley where the encounter had taken place became something of a shrine. People would walk down it and whisper about what had happened. They would tell their children the story. They would speak about it in churches and barbershops and living rooms. It was a story that gave hope to people living in a city that didn't often provide hope. It was a story that suggested that there were ways to resist the powers that oppressed you. That there were ways to win without destroying yourself in the process. In 1968, 5 years after the encounter in the alley, a young journalist named Michael Torres was researching organized crime in New York. His investigation led him to Harlem, and eventually, to an interview with Bumpy Johnson. They met in Morrison's Diner, the same place where Bumpy had confronted 5 detectives 6 years earlier. Michael ordered coffee and pie. Bumpy ordered his usual sweet potato pie and his own coffee from his thermos. "People tell stories about you," Michael said. "The most famous one is about an alley, about you meeting the butcher." Bumpy smiled slightly. "People tell lots of stories," he said. "Is it true?" Michael asked. "Did you really face him down?" Bumpy set down his fork. "What I learned a long time ago," Bumpy said, "is that the truth of a story isn't about what physically happened. It's about what it means. It's about what people understand from it." "But, did it happen?" Michael pressed. "Something happened," Bumpy said. "I met a man who'd made a career of being the thing people feared most. I realized that he wasn't evil, he was just lost. He'd been given a purpose by people who didn't care about him, and he'd accepted that purpose without questioning it. I tried to help him see that he could be something else." "And did it work?" Michael asked. "I don't know," Bumpy said. "I hope it did. I hope that somewhere, that man is living a life that has meaning beyond what other people have told him is meaningful. That would be worth something." On July 7, 1968, Bumpy Johnson had a massive heart attack while walking through Harlem. He was rushed to Presbyterian Hospital, but the doctors couldn't save him. He died at 5:37 in the evening, his family around him. He was 62 years old. The streets of Harlem shut down for his funeral. Thousands came, drug dealers and legitimate businessmen, hustlers and church ladies, community organizers and street fighters. The funeral went on for hours, and speech after speech was given about the man who'd changed Harlem. But the story that kept coming back, the story that was told most frequently, was the story of the alley. The night Bumpy Johnson had faced the butcher and had walked away victorious not because he'd killed him, but because he'd somehow made him see his own humanity. That was the story that defined Bumpy Johnson's legacy. Not the drugs he sold, not the money he made, not the territory he controlled, but the moment when he'd proven that the most important victories aren't physical, they're psychological, they're spiritual. They're the victories that come when you can make your enemy see that he's human. 20 years later, in 1988, Michael Torres was still a journalist. Now working on his third book about organized crime in New York, he'd had a long career covering crime stories, and one of his most famous pieces had been about that encounter in the alley. Based on his 1968 interview with Bumpy Johnson, he decided to try to find Vincent Rizzuto, the butcher. It took him 6 months and numerous contacts in law enforcement and the underworld, but he finally tracked down a man living quietly in San Diego, California. A man who'd lived under an assumed name for over 20 years. A man who worked at a small hardware store and lived in a modest apartment and went to church on Sundays. The man agreed to an interview on the condition of anonymity. "I don't know how you found me," the man said, "but I'd prefer that nobody else does." "I'm not going to reveal your location," Michael promised. "I just want to understand what happened that night in Harlem." The man was in his 60s now, his face weathered, his eyes different from how they'd been described in files and police records. These eyes had warmth. These eyes had humanity. "That night," the man said slowly, "I understood that I'd been living a lie. I understood that I'd killed people because I'd been told to kill people, and I'd accepted that without ever asking why. I'd accepted that I was a tool, that I was nothing more than a weapon for other men to use." He paused. "But when I looked into that man's eyes, when I looked at Bumpy Johnson in that alley, saw someone who wasn't afraid of me. I saw someone who understood me better than I understood myself. And for the first time, I was afraid. I was afraid of continuing to be what I'd been." "Did you ever contact him after that night?" Michael asked. "No," the man said. "I came here and built a new life. I went to work, paid my bills, treated people with respect. I've been a different man than the man I was. And I owe that to Bumpy Johnson. I owe that to the fact that he cared enough to speak truth to me when he could have just fought me." Michael leaned forward. "Do you think you would have killed him if things had gone differently, if he hadn't stepped into the alley and faced you?" The man looked out the window at the street below. "I would have tried," he said. "I would have done what I was paid to do, and I probably would have succeeded. I was very good at what I did, but then what? Then I would have been a killer who'd murdered a legend, and I would have had to live with that. I would have had to live with the knowledge that I'd destroyed something important. I don't think I could have survived that, not really. I would have found a way to stop existing, one way or another." He turned back to Michael. "But instead, Bumpy Johnson taught me that I could change, that a man can stop being what he's been and become something else. And because of that, I'm still here, still alive, still trying to understand how to be a human being instead of a weapon." Michael Torres wrote about this interview in his third book, *The Hidden Redemptions of New York's Criminal Underworld*. The chapter about Vincent Rizzuto and Bumpy Johnson became one of the most widely read parts of the book. It challenged the narrative that crime in New York was just about violence and money. It suggested that even in the darkest moments, in the most violent confrontations, there was room for human transformation. The book won critical acclaim. It was nominated for several awards, and it ensured that the story of that night in the alley lived on long after both Bumpy Johnson and Vincent Rizzuto had passed away. In 1995, when Michael Torres was 75 years old and had retired from journalism, he sat down and wrote a final article about Bumpy Johnson, not for publication, but for himself. A personal reflection on what that man had meant to him, what that story had meant to his entire career. "I spent my life documenting crime," he wrote. "I spent decades writing about murderers and drug dealers and organized crime families, but the most important lesson I learned came from a man who was all of those things, a man who sold drugs, who was involved in violence, who was part of the criminal underworld. What Bumpy Johnson taught me was that a person is never just one thing. A man can be criminal and prophet. He can be dealer and healer. He can be violent and peaceful. He can be the product of a broken system and still be the one who shows others how to break free from that system." The story of that night in the alley represents something that transcends criminology. It represents the possibility of human transformation. It represents the idea that you can meet your enemy and make him question what he is, not through violence, but through truth. That's a lesson that applies far beyond the world of crime. That's a lesson about how to approach the most difficult confrontations in life. Stand firm, speak truth. Don't give in to fear. And recognize that even your enemy has the capacity to be human. Bumpy Johnson did that with a professional killer. And somehow, through that act of recognition, through that act of seeing humanity in a man who'd chosen not to see his own humanity, he changed everything. The story of that night in the Harlem alley lived on. It lived first in whispers. Those whispers traveled through the streets of Harlem like wind through canyons, changing shape as they moved, but never losing their essential truth. Old men who'd been there that night, the ones who'd emerged from the shadows as witnesses, told their sons and grandsons about it. They sat on stoops on summer evenings and recounted what they'd seen. They gathered in barbershops during slow afternoons and reconstructed the moment, piece by piece, always arriving at the same conclusion. Something impossible had happened, and it had changed everything. It lived in the books and articles written about organized crime and urban legends. In 1975, criminologists began to cite the incident as a pivotal moment, the moment when the Italian families recognized that Harlem could not be conquered through conventional means. Historians included it in their surveys as a case study in the psychology of violence. Sociologists analyzed it as an example of conflict resolution that transcended traditional paradigms. The story was examined from every conceivable angle. But no matter how many times it was dissected, the core truth remained. On a summer night in 1963, something had happened that shouldn't have been possible. It lived in the memories of people who'd lived through that era, who'd heard the story directly from those who'd been there. Marcus Williams was one of the men in the shadows that night. He lived until 1996, spending the last decades of his life telling the story to anyone who would listen. "I was a young man then," he said in an interview recorded in 1992. "We were trained to think violence was the solution to everything. You had a disagreement, you fought. Someone disrespected you, you fought. That was how the world worked. But that night in the alley, I learned something different. I learned that Bumpy wasn't thinking about fighting. He was thinking about the humanity of the man he was facing. He was thinking about redemption." There was also Constance, the waitress from Morrison's Diner, who served Bumpy pie for decades. She lived to 92, becoming something of an oracle, a keeper of memories from that era. Young people would come to the diner specifically to hear her stories. "Bumpy changed us," she said in 1994, 2 years before she died. "He made us understand that we didn't have to be afraid all the time. He made us understand that we could stand up to people with power and not be destroyed." That was everything to a community that had been taught to be afraid for our entire lives. It lived in the consciousness of a community that had produced a man who could face down violence with philosophy. Harlem became known as the place that had produced Bumpy Johnson, not for his criminal activities, but for what he'd represented. The idea that a man born into poverty, imprisoned, marked as a criminal, could find a way to be something more than those definitions. This changed how young people in Harlem thought about themselves. If Bumpy could be both criminal and prophet, then maybe they didn't have to accept the narrow definitions society tried to impose on them. In 1985, a community center opened in Harlem dedicated to Bumpy Johnson's memory. It wasn't primarily about celebrating his narcotics empire. It was about celebrating what he'd represented, the idea that a man could stand against overwhelming odds and refuse to surrender. That a man could look into the eyes of darkness and make it blink first. The consciousness of the community shifted. There was a sense that Harlem was special, that it had produced something unique, that it was a place where men could stand against overwhelming power and not be destroyed. That night in a Harlem alley became proof that even in moments where death feels inevitable, another path can still exist. When the butchers stood ready to kill, Bumpy Johnson did not respond with violence. He responded with words, truths so direct and human that they reached a part of the killer long buried. By naming the butcher's lost humanity and offering the possibility of being something more, Bumpy disrupted a fate that seemed certain. The confrontation became not a physical battle, but a contest of understanding. And Bumpy won by seeing his opponent more clearly than the man saw himself. The butcher, a figure defined by darkness and detachment, was forced to confront his own humanity under Bumpy's steady gaze. Without fear or weapons, Bumpy made the darkness hesitate. The armor cracked, and the man beneath it emerged long enough to choose not to kill. In that alley in 1963, clarity and moral courage proved stronger than force, transforming violence into restraint. The story echoed far beyond that night. In Harlem, it became legend retold in schools, churches, and community spaces as a reminder that resistance does not always require violence. It taught that power can come from refusing fear, from rejecting the terms of a violent conflict, and from insisting on humanity, even in those who deny it. For generations, the tale endured as a symbol of transformation and hope. It offered a different definition of victory, one achieved through understanding rather than destruction, through courage rather than force. The legacy of that night reminded people that even in the deepest darkness, change remains possible, and that sometimes the most powerful act is to face fear without becoming it.